Hi there, this is Chris Kellett with MuseGrid, and we're going to take a look at creating the gradient buttons that we have in our button pack. So let's first of all grab those buttons and put them on the page, and then we can dissect them and see how they're built. So let's just drag that onto the page here so we can see all of those nice colourful gradient buttons on the page here. And let's make this background, let's make that browse full width, so we'll make that browser full width, and we're also going to right click and lock that down just so that that's going to stay in place when we're working on these. Let's now preview these buttons, and we can see that these gradient buttons have this really nice colored effect. So they've got this nice gradient, different colors, very bright. And there's also an image behind it so that you can see that image there. Now this is something that you may think was created in Photoshop, but it's created completely in Muse. So these buttons have the dark button that when you hover over it fades into that nice color, and the reverse on the other side. Let's go back to our buttons here and let's remove these ones and just focus on these two, so we can learn the principle of how this is done, and then you can apply the same principle to the buttons you create. Now these buttons are made actually in 3 separate parts, so let's take those apart so we can see that we have a text frame, we have another text frame, and then we're using a state button widget, so Muse's own state button widget. So that is how this button is built. We have the state button in the background, and that has the fill image applied to it, and we've used the fill image centered with scale to fill. Now you could set it to whatever position you want. These dots here, if you're not aware, change the position of where the image starts. So you can see we're choosing center here, but you could choose the bottom or the top, depending on how you wanted it to scale. And by having that set, that no matter what we do with this button, that image is always going to fill that space. Now above that image we have a text frame again, and we've applied a gradient to it. But the gradient is semi-transparent, so we have this purple going to this blue, but we're using 85% opacity so that the image behind it shows through. So the image then becomes colored by the gradient fill on this text frame. Now we're using a text frame because we want it to be dimensionally accurate compared to the top layer. If you just used a rectangle, you may have to fiddle around a bit to get it to the right dimensions. But by using a text frame, we've just replicated this and removed the text and applied the gradient. For a start, it makes the workflow faster, but it also means that we can control the exact dimensions a lot easier when we're building, and certainly when we're changing the size of an item, if we're changing the content and so on. So we have this state button here, and I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger because I want to show you a feature of using the state button. And then we add in our text frame with the gradient, with the semi-transparent gradient, and then we add the next layer is going to be the text, and we pop that on top. And the great thing with using a state button as well, let's make sure that those are right at the top corner here, is that we can drag the state button, even if it's slightly bigger, we can drag it over the top. And once we drag it smaller than its contents, it will bounce out and just take the structure of its content. So it's really useful to, when you're putting contents together, to have your button slightly bigger so that you can just make sure that it fits nice and neatly. Now let's take a look at these parts as well, to the effect that's happening. So we've got this dark button sitting on top of the gradient, sitting on top of the image. And what we're doing with this button is that we've made it fully opaque, so it's 100% opacity. We've got the color fill there. But what we're doing with the rollover state is we're fading the button out using the transition, and we're basically taking the color back to 1%. So we're not taking it back to 0 because that would remove all color. We're taking it to 1%, so it's basically not going to show at all. And by using a 1% color rather than 0, it means that we can get this nice fade transition. So when we hover over it, the button fades out to reveal the color underneath. But because we're only fading the background color, we're not using the transparency here because that would fade the text as well. We're actually just fading the background color, which keeps the white text in place, fades that out, reveals the color that's sitting over the image, and that's how we get that nice effect. So let's put it all together. And we can see that when we move an item into the button, we get that slightly thicker blue line to tell us that it's going to reside in there. And we can just make sure that that's sitting in that top left corner. Now, the other thing with the state button is when you're placing its content, you want to make sure that you want to put it at the top left corner, because that's where the state buttons particularly, that's where they are anchored, is top left. So when you drag content out, when you drag the button, make it bigger, you can see that the content inside it sits top left. Now, if you moved the content and started working from, let's say, this side, you would find that when you try to resize it, it would actually push the content out of the button. And if you try to resize it this way, you can see that it's not going to snap into place like it was before. So you want to make sure that your items inside your state button are sitting top left. Okay, so we've got that nice and neat there. Let's pop that in there. Make sure that's sitting directly above where it needs to be. There we go. So we can see that if we zoom in a bit here. And remember, we switched on our show frame edges, so we can see the frame edges here. We can see that that's just in the right place, and we can see that that sits there nice. Now, when we resize the button, there we go. So it's perfectly aligned in perfect dimensions now. So when we preview this now, we can see that that dark button on the top is fading out, revealing the color underneath that's sitting on top of the image, and that's how we get that effect. And because we're just fading out the background color and not the whole button, that's how we get our text to sit on top. Now, sometimes people with state buttons, they do something like this. They'll take a text block, they'll create something like this. Let's change the text color. And they'll even maybe centralize it, but then they start trying to get it just right. By doing it that way, you can end up with it being slightly misaligned, and then you get the feeling that the text is moving when you go between the hover states. And that's why I always like to start a button with a text frame using the spacing, so that I know that in each hover state, the text is going to be perfectly aligned. So we can pop this back together again now. Let's pop that back there like that, and we can pop that. And that's how that button was created. Now obviously the reverse is being done with this button. We've still got the three parts here, so I can see that there's our three parts, much like the other button here. But what I'm doing here is I'm starting off with a fill of 1% opacity, and then on the rollover state we are then going to a full 100% opacity. So then we're doing the reverse of this button, and that's all that's being done here. Now the great thing with this is you can change the image in the background very easily. Just select the button as a whole, change the fill image, and we can go in and change the gradient colors. So let's go from, let's say for instance in our fill here, let's go from this nice color here to maybe an orange. And then when we put that over the top, you can see we've now got that new gradient. Pop that in there. And when we hit refresh, you've now got that new button style. So it's really very easy to build these gorgeous buttons, just starting with some very basic shapes, text frames, getting our spacing right, and then just using the tools that are built into Muse to create these layered effects that create these really nice buttons. So that's how we made the gradient button. Let's take a look at our next button set.